the real reason why these actors left MASH. What if I told you that one of the most beloved characters in television history was killed off without most of the actors even knowing it was coming, and that the star who played him spent the rest of his life saying it was the biggest mistake he ever made? For 11 seasons, MASH made America laugh through one of the darkest backdrops imaginable, a field hospital in the middle of the Korean War. But behind that laughter, there was real tension, real heartbreak, and a revolving door of departures that changed the show forever. Some actors left because they felt boxed in. Some left because the role was quietly destroying them. And one left so suddenly that the writers had to scramble just to explain his absence. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why each of these stars walked away from one of the most successful shows ever made, and what happened to them after the cameras stopped rolling. Before we get into the departures themselves, it helps to understand what made MASH such a strange and special show in the first place. It began as a novel written by a former Korean war surgeon, published under a pen name, and that book eventually became a film directed by Robert Altman that shocked and delighted audiences with its mix of dark comedy and anti-war sentiment. When the television adaptation launched in 1972, right as the Vietnam War was dragging on and dividing the country, it took that same irreverent energy and stretched it across 11 years and hundreds of episodes. The show didn't lean on a laugh track the way most sitcoms of the era did. It used real sound design, genuine emotional stakes, and characters that were allowed to grow, change, and sometimes disappear entirely. That last part is what made MASH different from almost every other sitcom on the air. Actors didn't just fade into the background when they wanted out. Their characters were reassigned, discharged, or in one unforgettable case, killed. That willingness to break the rules of television is exactly why so many of these exits still resonate with fans decades later. The first major departure, and arguably still the most talked about moment in the show's history, involved the actor who played Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake. From the very first episode, Henry was the flustered, well-meaning commanding officer who never quite had control of his own hospital, but who brought a warmth that balanced out the chaos around him. The actor behind him earned a Golden Globe for the role and was, by every measure, a fan favorite. But privately, he wanted more. He had ambitions of leading his own show rather than playing a supporting figure to a cast that was increasingly built around the character of Hawkeye Pierce. As the series matured, the writers leaned harder into Hawkeye's perspective, and that shift left Henry Blake, and the actor playing him, feeling like he had become an afterthought rather than an anchor. So, at the end of the third season, he told the producers he wouldn't be returning. What happened next became one of the most famous moments in television history. Rather than writing Henry off with a quiet reassignment, the creators decided to do something no major sitcom had really done before. They gave him a joyful, tearful send-off episode, full of celebration and hugs and the sense that he was finally going home to his family. And then, in the final scene, a young company clerk walked into the operating room and delivered the news that Henry's plane had gone down over the sea, with no survivors. There was no music, no dramatic build-up, just stunned silence and the sound of medical equipment. Most of the cast hadn't been told in advance, so the shock on their faces was real. The reaction from viewers was intense and immediate, with letters pouring and expressing everything from heartbreak to outrage. The producers stood by the decision, explaining that they wanted to remind audiences that in a real war, not everyone makes it home. As for the actor himself, his career after MASH didn't go the way he had hoped. He signed a new deal and starred in a couple of sitcoms of his own, but neither one connected with audiences the way MASH had, and both were canceled relatively quickly. In interviews years later, he was candid about his regret, acknowledging that leaving had been a mistake and that he had underestimated just how rare and special the show truly was. He continued to work steadily in television for the rest of his career, but he never found another role that resonated with audiences the way Henry Blake had. When he passed away in the mid-1990s, tributes came in from across the cast, remembering him not just as a talented performer, but as a genuinely kind person to work with. If Henry's exit was loud and unforgettable, the next major departure was almost the opposite. The actor who played Trapper John McIntyre, Hawkeye's original partner in crime, simply vanished from the show with almost no explanation at all. Trapper and Hawkeye had been the comedic engine of the early seasons, trading jokes and pulling pranks in a way that gave the show its rebellious energy. But as the series went on and Hawkeye's character absorbed more of the emotional and narrative focus, the actor playing Trapper began to feel like his role had been reduced to little more than a sidekick who agreed with everything Hawkeye said. He had reportedly joined the show expecting something closer to a true ensemble, and when that didn't materialize, he chose not to return for a fourth season. What makes this departure especially unusual is how it happened. His contract situation was informal enough that when producers considered legal action over his sudden exit, they realized they had no real grounds to pursue it. There was no farewell episode, no emotional goodbye scene, nothing. The writers were forced to open the next season by simply stating that Trapper had been discharged while Hawkeye happened to be away, and a new character was introduced to fill the gap left behind. That new character brought a steadier, more grounded energy to the show, and many longtime viewers argue that the series actually deepened creatively once the shift occurred, even if it lost some of its early buddy comedy spark. As for the actor who played Trapper, he didn't disappear from public life so much as he redirected it entirely. He eventually moved away from acting and built a genuinely successful career in finance, becoming a familiar face on financial news programs decades later. Despite how abruptly he left, there doesn't appear to have been any lasting resentment between him and his former castmates, and when he passed away in 2015, tributes from the cast described him as sharp, funny, and deeply missed. The next departure is one of the more emotionally complicated stories in the show's history, because it wasn't really about ambition or ego at all. It was about burnout. The actor who played company clerk Radar O'Reilly brought an innocence and gentleness to the show that made him one of its most beloved figures, a young man with an almost supernatural ability to sense incoming helicopters before anyone else could hear them. He was also the only cast member to reprise his role from the original film, and he shaped the character into something far more tender and vulnerable than the source material had suggested. But as the seasons wore on, the demands of the production began to take a real toll on him. He was reportedly dealing with anxiety and the emotional weight of being away from his young family for long stretches at a time, and he found himself increasingly exhausted by the grind of network television. He asked for adjustments to his workload, and the producers tried to accommodate him where they could, but eventually he decided it was simply time to go. Unlike the abrupt exit of Trapper John, this departure was given real weight on screen. The character's farewell arc showed him returning home to help his struggling family, and the final image of him walking away, leaving behind a beloved keepsake, remains one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire series. After leaving the show, the actor stepped back from the spotlight almost entirely. He appeared in a short-lived spin-off, but ultimately chose to redirect his energy toward painting, wildlife conservation, and even inventing, eventually holding patents unrelated to entertainment at all. In his own words, he left to focus on his family and to recover from what he described as genuine burnout, and by most accounts, that choice gave him a much quieter and healthier life than the one he left behind. Then there's the story of the actor who played the show's original comic villain, Major Frank Burns. For the first 5 seasons, Frank was the character audiences loved to dislike, a rigid, insecure rule follower who was constantly the butt of the joke. But as the show around him grew more nuanced, Frank essentially stayed frozen in place, a one-dimensional foil in a series that was becoming increasingly interested in complexity. The actor behind him recognized that limitation better than anyone. Rather than pushing for a larger, more sympathetic arc, he made the decision that he had taken the character as far as it could reasonably go, and he chose not to renew his contract once his deal ended. He wasn't fired, and there was no dramatic falling out. It was simply a mutual understanding that the character had run its course. His exit ended up being a turning point for the show creatively. With Frank gone, there was no longer a need for a cartoonish antagonist, and the series was free to explore more layered conflicts between its characters instead of relying on an easy punchline. In his place came a new antagonist, Major Charles Emerson Winchester, played by an actor who brought a very different energy to the role, one built on cultured arrogance rather than bumbling insecurity. Winchester started off insufferable by design, but over time the writers peeled back his layers to reveal someone who was, in his own guarded way, deeply affected by the war around him. Unlike almost everyone else on this list, the actor who played Winchester stayed with the show all the way through its final episode, closing out the character with a quiet, poetic moment involving a group of prisoners of war and a shared love of classical music. When he was offered the chance to continue the character in a spin-off series, he turned it down, feeling that Winchester's story had already reached its natural conclusion. Later in life, he became known for extensive voice acting work, and he spoke openly about his identity later in his career, a decision that took real courage in an industry that wasn't always welcoming to that kind of honesty at the time. He passed away in 2018, remembered by colleagues for both his talent and his integrity. It's worth pointing out that not everyone who left MASH did so because they were unhappy or burned out. Some departures were simply the natural result of a story reaching its end, and some cast members never left at all. Among the women of the show, the actor who played Major Margaret Houlihan stands out for the opposite reason every other name on this list stands out. She stayed for all 11 seasons, one of the only performers to appear in both the very first episode and the very last. Her character began as a fairly one-note figure, defined largely by a nickname and a handful of running jokes, but the actress pushed for something more substantial with every passing season. By the time the show ended, Margaret had become a fully realized officer, a skilled nurse, and one of the few characters who was allowed to openly question the morality of the war she was serving in. Her persistence in shaping that role over more than a decade is its own kind of quiet departure story, a reminder that not every meaningful exit involves leaving at all. Looking back across all of these stories, a pattern starts to emerge. Almost every major departure from MASH came down to the same core tension, the gap between what an actor signed up for and what the role eventually became. Some, like the actor behind Henry Blake, wanted a bigger spotlight and left to chase it, only to realize later how rare what he'd walked away from truly was. Others, like the actor behind Trapper John, felt reduced by a show that was growing around someone else's character and simply chose not to stick around for it. Some left because the emotional toll of the work became too heavy to carry, and others left because they had, quite simply, said everything their character needed to say. And at least one stayed through it all, turning a supporting role into one of the show's most quietly powerful arcs. What makes MASH so unusual, even decades later, is that the show never tried to hide these departures or paper over them with easy explanations. It let characters be discharged, reassigned, or killed because it was a show fundamentally about the unpredictability of war and, by extension, the unpredictability of the people living through it. Every actor who left changed the shape of the series in a way that a typical sitcom rarely allows, and in many cases, those changes ended up making the show richer rather than weaker. It's a rare thing for a series to survive that much turnover and still be remembered as one of the greatest television dramas or comedies ever made, but MASH managed to do exactly that. If you've made it this far, you clearly love this show as much as we do, so let us know in the comments which departure hit you the hardest and which character you wish had stuck around a little longer. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.